Great, looks good.
Oh, okay. So let's actually get going. So good morning, everyone. Okay. Today we're going to be talking about what your digestion says about you, or the subtle symptoms of stress, the digestive issue. Okay. My name is Joanne Oposidolo. I am the registered physiotherapist and a certified public health therapist at Toronto Athletic Club Sports Medicine Clinic. And my partner in crime today is...
Hi guys, I'm Dr. Melissa Cugliari and I am the resident naturopath at the Sport Medicine Clinic, also at the Toronto Athletic Club.
Okay. Before we get going, just a quick housekeeping. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a couple of functions. You can always put in a question during the chat, and you can kind of as we go along, but we'll prefer if you ask questions at the very end. We have a jam-packed schedule for you guys. We'll quickly, and there may be a part 2 coming along. The webinar is also being recorded, so if you do have a question, please let us know. Okay. So to begin, we really want to make sure that you guys know that your health is your wealth. So how you feel is definitely going to impact your quality of life throughout the entire thing. Our agenda today, we're going to be talking about stress in the autonomic nervous system, followed by the physiology of digestion, then naturopathic interventions, physiotherapy interventions, and then questions at the end if we have time. Okay. So part 1, stress in the autonomic nervous system. So stress itself is our body's reaction to any change that requires an adjustment. It could be physical, mental, emotional response, and it is a normal part of life. Stresses can be a perceived threat, a challenge, your environment, physical obstacle, a psychological barrier, your body, or your thoughts. There are 2 different types of stress, eustress and distress. Eustress is more motivating, while distress is more a cause of anxiety or concern and perceived as being outside of our coping abilities. Okay, so our autonomic nervous system is basically in charge of how our body regulates stress. So it controls the unconscious parts of our bodily functions, and it controls the smooth muscles and organs for homeostasis, specific for heart rate, digestion, our respiratory rate, our pupillary response, so how our eyes in terms of tunnel vision or dilation, urination, and sexual arousal. Okay. Our autonomic nervous system can be broken down into different branches. So there's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. They balance each other out. So the sympathetic is more in charge of fight or flight, whereas the parasympathetic is more rest and digest. Then we have a bit in the middle called the enteric nervous system, which is our gut-brain connection. And all of these have to do significantly with how we digest our food. Okay. So an example of this is a threat occurs, our brain is activated, and specific in our brain are amygdala and hypothalamus, which sends responses to our pituitary gland, which releases hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. So this means that our heart rate increases, our digestion slows or stops, our respiratory rate increases, and we start to begin to have tunnel vision or dilated pupils. We also have a decreased urine output, and the sexual arousal is limited or completely inhibited. Okay. So with time, what tends to happen, and with a lot of stress, what tends to happen is we have a decreased pain threshold, poor sleep quality, digestive issues, and poor bowel movement, sexual difficulties, decreased recovery and regeneration, and a compromised immune system. Okay. So we're now going to talk about how digestion works. So over to you, Melissa. You're on mute.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Great. Okay, so as was mentioned earlier, stress has a massive impact on digestion. Those hormones that the body releases when we are perceiving stressful stimulus outside of us. So as Joanne mentioned, like a threat, maybe it's like an email from your boss or a stressful deadline. The body's going to release those hormones that maybe make you more alert and productive in the moment, but these sorts of hormones will unfortunately shut down any bodily functions that aren't deemed absolutely necessary in that moment. And digestion is one of them. So let's take a step back before we get into that and discuss the digestive system on the whole, because digestion is incredibly relevant to your health and is absolutely foundational to wellness now, but also throughout your lifespan. So here you have an image of the human digestive tract. So digestion actually begins before we even put food or beverage in our system. So perhaps you're cooking, you smell food, you can see it. And from there, the brain perceives that it's time to start that process. So with that, different enzymes are released in the mouth. You start to salivate when you smell really good food. And then the next step would be actually putting the food into your system. So into the mouth, where you chew, and then also where saliva is excreted. And the chewing process starts to break down the foods. And the saliva has within it enzymes that begin to break down our carbohydrates. So once we do that first step or second step, we swallow the food then goes through the esophagus. So you can see there that long tube down the neck, right into the stomach. And the stomach is a place that also releases different secretions, particularly stomach acid, also known as hydrochloric acid. And that's another way, along with chewing, for the body to start to break down the foods into smaller particles and molecules. Food spends about 24 to 72 hours in the stomach. And a lot of things are digested here. I mean, protein is the main thing that's going to be digested here. So we really want to facilitate that release of stomach acid and the chewing process, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Then from there, the food will start to move through that smaller tube just at the end of the stomach into what's called the duodenum, and that's where your liver and your gallbladder come into play more so, and your fats start to be digested. Then from there, the food will move through into the small intestine, which you can also see on the image there. And the food spends about 3 to 5 hours. So the tube is really long. Your small intestine is really long, but the food doesn't spend a ton of time in this area, only about 3 to 5 hours. Certain nutrients are digested here. Some fluids are absorbed. But the real star of the show is your large intestine, where your food or broken down food spends about 24 to 72 hours. So this is a really long time. It's a slow process. This is where a lot of our fluids are absorbed, and certain nutrients as well. So we always want to be boasting the functionality of the large intestine along with all of the other organ systems in your digestive tract. And then from there, what the body doesn't need will be excreted through the rectum and the anus as a bowel movement. And bowel movements are a really important thing to consider as well. So before we continue, I thought I'd ask a little question here. What's the best parameter for gut health? So you have your answers: A, bowel movements; B, how you feel after you eat; or C, your breath. Give you a second. Okay, we can go to the answer. What do you guys think? Let's see, bowel movements. So your bowel movements are an excellent indicator of your gut health. And as many of us know, when we're stressed, sometimes our bowel movement quality shifts, right? I know this is kind of a topic that people laugh about or get a little embarrassed when talking about, but this is something I do not go a visit without speaking to my patients about, and I think Joanne, you're probably the same. It's such an important indicator of health. Here we have what's called the Bristol stool chart. This is a chart used by doctors, physiotherapists, gastroenterologists to help understand with their patients where their bowel movements fall on the chart, and then from there we can start to determine how the health of your gut is doing. So as you can see, it's a spectrum. Type 1 is more of your kind of constipated, dry stool side of the spectrum, and then you have all the way through to type 7, which is more of like a loose stool, diarrhea, and you can see all the descriptions in between. Now type 4 is your quote unquote healthy bowel movement. When you're having these type 4 bowel movements, that's telling us that that digestive tract I just went through is healthy. And also that your stress response is healthy. That doesn't mean you don't have any stress, but it means your response is healthy. And that's what Joanne and I will be talking about, how to ensure your body's response is healthy and how to ensure digestion stays well despite some of the stressors you experience. So you really want to make sure you have that type 4 bowel movement. That type 4 bowel movement looks kind of like it's the length of your forearm. It's very easy to pass. There's no undigested food, blood, or mucus in the stool. It feels like there's a full evacuation. So there's no straining, no urgency. It just feels comfortable. It feels healthy. I think we've all had those at least a couple of times in our life. Ideally, you're having that type of bowel movement on a daily basis. And if you're not, that's usually some indicator that stress is impacting your system negatively. So we can continue on and talk a little bit more about how stress itself impacts gut function. So as Joanne mentioned, our nervous system can respond in a couple of different ways to what's going on around us. One of the ways is a parasympathetic way of response, and this is your more rest and digest. So when you're in that rested, relaxed state, maybe how you'd feel after a yoga class or when you're laying on a beach on vacation, this sort of state favors digestion. So you have a big nerve that runs down your gut, kind of along like where you saw that esophagus run down. It runs closer to your spine. And this nerve is called your vagus nerve. And when we're in a relaxed state, the vagus nerve is telling the gut to be relaxed. It's telling the gut that, you know, you can produce enzymes you need to break down your foods. It's going to help with nutrient absorption. Things are going to move through the gut in a downward action. They're going to move forward through, and then ideally you're excreting what you don't need. This also occurs when we eat more slowly, more intentionally. So this is the state we want to be in. And we can go to the next slide. On the flip side, we have our more sympathetic way of responding to things around us. This is our more fight or flight. So I gave you the example, like when that email from your boss comes through, we go into that kind of phase, right? Or, you know, you see something stressful happening around you. Our ancestors, when they had to run from predators. This is a state you're going to go into. And as I said before, this is going to shut down any unnecessary functions. So digestion being one of those. It's not absolutely imperative to survival when you're stressed out. So unfortunately, digestion gets shut off. So what that translates to is that enzymes that are released by your gut, by your pancreas, by your liver, all these wonderful digestive organs, they're not going to be optimal, which means they're not going to be at high enough levels to digest your foods ideally. Well, I have here written the migrating motor complex is compromised. What that means is the ability for your gut to push things downward through the gut is compromised. So things start to sit. And from there, then we don't necessarily absorb nutrients well. There's more inflammation in the gut. Our microbiome, so our bacteria in the gut, can kind of err to the more unhealthy side of things. And then bowel movements can shift. So that's why we always love using that Bristol stool chart, because that can tell us how your digestive system is functioning and if in effect it's been shut off by stress. So just a couple of take homes here before we move into some naturopathic and physiotherapeutic interventions to help digestion. We always want to remember everything starts and ends in the gut. Your gut health is paramount. And ultimately, we're not only just what we eat, but we're also what we absorb and excrete. And stress really impacts our ability to absorb nutrients and then excrete out the toxins that we don't need through bowel movement. So really, in essence, if the gut isn't functioning properly, like it doesn't when we're stressed, your health will be compromised in some way eventually, whether it's because you're not absorbing your nutrients, maybe there's too much toxicity in the system, etc. So from here, we can start to talk a little bit about more around what we can do naturopathically, what we can do physiotherapeutically. So first, we'll talk about some naturopathic interventions. Here are a few things that I would go to when I sense a patient has issues with stress and digestion as a result. The first thing we'll always do is take a thorough history and consider any additional testing. So we want to see what's going on. Is your stress response totally out of whack? We can test your stress hormones. Maybe we do some stool testing to understand your microbiome better, et cetera. We'll go into that more in a second. Then the nutrition piece. It's absolutely foundational to consider what you're putting into your system. So we'll talk about that. Things like rehydration, meal hygiene, so the conditions around which you eat. We'll be talking more about that as well. Rebalancing your microbiome, which is basically that wonderful community of bacteria that lives in your gut, in your respiratory tract, in your genitourinary tract, on your skin. This is really compromised by stress. So we'll talk about how to promote a healthy microbiome. Optimizing sleep is something to consider when improving digestion. Herbal medicine, supplementation, so many things. So today, we'll be focusing primarily on the diagnostic testing, the nutrition aspect of things, what foods to remove, what to keep in, and then how to rebalance that gut microbiome. So first, as I touched on briefly, assessment and diagnostic testing is integral because we want to rule out any underlying causes of digestive concern. You know, we can treat you for digestive issues by giving you enzymes and by giving you supplements to just kind of help you feel better in the moment. But if we're not addressing what's really going on underneath, whether that's a bacterial imbalance or something else, maybe there's issues with your colon, maybe there's an autoimmune disease like IBD, irritable bowel disease, or Crohn's, colitis, celiac. If we're not testing for that stuff, it's going to be very hard to actually correct the problem. So we can go to our next slide. So ideally, your healthcare provider is taking a detailed history first, looking at all the symptoms mentioned here. Of course, bowel movements being that number one parameter, but then a few other things that sometimes seem unrelated, like your past health history, any surgeries, infections, hospitalizations. Travel history is a really important one when assessing digestion. Hormones absolutely impact digestion, so sometimes we do some case history on that. And then, of course, stress. Our diagnostic testing, I mean, the menu for possible diagnostic testings we would look to is massive, but here's a few. Sometimes we want to do stool testing. We want to look at what is in the stool. That gives us a good indicator of what's going on inside. Maybe we want to do some breath testing, which looks more at the gases emitted by different bacteria. It could be really helpful. Possibly food sensitivity, hormone testing. We can look at your inflammation levels through blood work. And then we can even go into genetic testing and things like that, depending on what you're presenting with. But always important to have this discussion with your healthcare provider at the outset of treatment, because like I said, if we're not treating the root cause of disturbance, very challenging to improve things. Okay, so let's talk first about nutrition when it comes to naturopathic interventions. We want to start replacing some offending foods or unhealthy foods with medicinal ones. Now, how do we do that? So before we do that, we need to understand nutrients are absolutely essential for life. If we don't have the proper nutrient intake, it's going to be very difficult for our bodies to get the fuel they need to function, but also to heal any damage that's already done. So this is a quote I always come back to. I think I say this in every presentation I do. It's a quote from a functional medicine doctor named Dr. Mark Hyman. He said, "There's no such thing as junk food. There is just junk and food." And I find this is like a really good guiding factor. I mean, I'm going to go through a bunch of other stuff in a minute, but if you come back to this while you grocery shop or select your meals, you'll be guided in the right direction, right? There's no such thing as junk food. It's just there's real foods that are whole, fresh, with an expiry date, don't even require ingredient lists because they just are what they are, versus foods where the labels are incredibly long, there's additives, they're very far from their natural form. So always coming back to this great guiding factor. So first, when we're talking about digestion, we always want to clean things up. We want to remove the things that are possibly disrupting digestion and making stress worse, really, if we're talking about stress here. So inflammatory foods are things like processed foods. So like I said before, foods that are not in their natural state. So what I mean by that is foods that have been processed. So you see, for example, a piece of wheat growing in a field versus a piece of bread or a baked good or pasta, right? That wheat has had to have been ground, it's been processed, it's been changed from its natural form into something entirely different. That's one example. So avoiding foods like refined carbohydrates, baked goods, candy, of course, soft drinks, juices, dressings, seasonings, sauces. These are all things that have totally disrupted nature and been changed into something entirely different. These are going to be really inflammatory on your system and totally disrupt digestion. Also sugar, and this includes alcohol. So anything with processed sugars, alcohol is a big one. These really disrupt our body's ability to properly maintain blood sugar levels, metabolism, for us to digest other foods. This increases food cravings. It makes it very hard also for us to stick to a healthy diet because our system will naturally want sugars more. So making sure you're avoiding these as much as possible. And then wheat and gluten are two ones to consider as well. These can be quite inflammatory for the gut. So being mindful of your consumption around those as well, especially if you suffer with digestion. Maybe you take a period of time and you avoid these entirely, then maybe we reintroduce to see where you land, see how you feel. Other things to consider, poor quality fats. There's a huge list here. These sorts of foods are very inflammatory, and instead you can opt for really healthy options like avocado, coconut oil, extra virgin olive oil, etc. So I always like to focus more on what I can eat. So focusing on the types of fats you can eat that are healthy for you, that are actually going to not only taste good, but support digestive function. So instead of these kind of inflammatory foods that will aggravate the gut and change how we digest, I always suggest consuming whole, fresh foods where possible. So these are things like plant-based eating is very, very important. So when structuring your meals, one thing to consider is starting with a vegetable base. And I'll give you an image in a second to help you kind of understand what this might look like on a plate. But you're going to start with a vegetable base. So choose your vegetables first. Maybe it's a variety of steamed vegetables, a very large salad with mixed lettuces and vegetables. The more color you get, the more nutrients you're going to get. So really opt for variety there. These are really gut healing and just stress reducing foods. Then you want to add protein. Protein is so important to support health and stress response. So maybe you're a vegetarian or maybe not. There's a few options here. You could do an organic piece of chicken, some wild caught fish, or perhaps legumes are more your style, whatever works, but having that protein. Usually a serving of protein is the size and thickness of your palm or the size of a cupped palm. Then you have your healthy fats, which I mentioned earlier. And then when it comes to sauces or dressings, stick to things that are super natural. So olive oil and lemon, balsamic vinegar and olive oil. Avoid pre-made sauces, like use things like herbs, spices, all that good stuff. So here's an image to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. You can see the image on the right is what we're going for. But these are two similar meals, right? You can characterize these both as quote unquote steak dinners, but it's just the focus shifts, right? So we want to focus more on the plants. In the plate on the right, you have more diversity in color. You have your really healthy fat there with the avocado. The protein is in an adequate portion. And then you've got your wide array of vegetables, and your starchy kind of carbohydrate there will be your sweet potato. So that's like a really nice, robust meal where you're getting lots of nutrients, but still delicious, still a steak dinner, still something you could enjoy. Couple of additional tips that I'm just going to fly through here because we already spoke a lot about these. Variety in your foods. Herbs and spices are really important. These are going to give you more nutrients, and they're actually very gut healing, particularly your herbs and spices. You also want to think about buying organic and local where possible. This is going to minimize the toxins introduced into the system so that the gut stays healthy and happy. One way to delineate what to buy organic and what is safe to buy conventional is using the list, the Dirty Dozen, Clean 15. These are lists published by the Environmental Working Group every year about which foods are safest to buy inorganic and which ones should be bought organic. So you can look that up, very easy to find online, very helpful resource. And I mentioned before, vegetables, plant-based eating is really important. So if vegetables are something that you have trouble getting enough servings in, you need about 4 cups of vegetables per day to hit your serving, your minimum servings. You can think about things like fresh pressed vegetable juices or green smoothies. And then, like I said before with the quote, not eating junk, but eating real foods. To do that, most of your shopping will be done around the perimeter of the grocery store where all the fresh foods are located. So if you're sticking to those aisles primarily, you're kind of on the right track. So that's a good way to think about it. So meal hygiene is another important piece. Basically, meal hygiene just refers to the conditions around which you eat. If you're eating in a stressful environment or while you're stressed, like I said before, digestion is essentially shut off in this state. So always making sure you're eating meals that are in a calm, relaxed environment. Now that many of us are working from home, really take the time away from your screen, away from your workspace to have a meal in an area that's designated for eating only. If you are stressed, if you are having a busy day or you lead a really busy lifestyle, perhaps this means eating smaller meals or snacks every 2 to 3 hours, so more frequently but less volume. This is going to favor digestion even though you may be in a stressed state, and making sure that you're including protein. Protein is so key. So the last piece I will talk about today in terms of naturopathic interventions are probiotics. So that bacterial balance in the gut is really important to consider. It's always compromised when we're stressed. So here's a couple of reasons why, or cases in which you would use probiotics. You want to use them after antibiotic use, after use medications, if you lead a stressful lifestyle where you're going through a period of stress, or if you find yourself eating a poor diet or you don't have the right lifestyle balance, or possibly when you're ill. So probiotics, the quality varies dramatically. So always speaking to a healthcare provider like myself before you start supplementation to ensure you're getting the right strains of probiotic, the right balance, really reputable company. So that's that. Oh, last piece here, just a couple of plant-based foods to help support that bacterial balance. You have your steamed greens, 1 cup daily, ideally organic. your ground flaxseed, 2 tablespoons a day. This can be taken in smoothies, in a bit of applesauce, over salads and soups. And then your really high pigmented foods, the foods that are purple and red, like organic berries, purple cabbage. These are really, really helpful for your microbiome and gut health overall. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Joanne, who's going to go over some physiotherapeutic solutions for digestion and stress.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. That was so informative and such amazing information. So we're going to go through physiotherapy solutions, and it seems a little bit off the beaten path to actually think of physiotherapy when you're thinking of digestion, but it's so key. So let's go back to the successful bowel movements and like the very last bit, which was step 7, excretion, okay, or evacuation. So a successful bowel movement is a precise coordination of gentle, deep abdominal contractions while simultaneously fully relaxing the pelvic floor muscles. So we need to ask, what and where is your pelvic floor muscles? So your pelvic floor muscles make a bowl or a hammock. So I'm going to stop the screen for a second, and we're just going to share really quickly. So right over here, this is a symbol of the pelvis. Okay, so you have your pubic bone right over here, and then you have your tailbone over here, just a landmark. Okay, so if we go inside right over here, we can see the red part right over here is the pelvic floor muscles, which attach from the tailbone all the way to the pubic bone, and then from one sits bone to another. So they create a nice base or hammock in order to support certain organs such as your bladder, your uterus, if you do have it, as well as your rectum right over here. So if you see it, it actually has a good, nice supportive system with them sitting one on top of each other. Okay, so let's just go back to the shared chart. Okay. Okay, so it has 5 specific functions. It's for support, which we talked about, stability for your lower back, hips, and pelvis, sphincteric, which actually controls urinary output and also bowel movements and evacuation, sexual arousal, and sump pump, which means that it pumps blood from your lower body and lymph from your lower body back up into your heart. Okay. So your pelvic floor is also part of your core muscles. So along with your diaphragm, your multifidi, which link up one vertebrae to another, and your transverse abdominals, they make up your core muscles, which help to stabilize the rest of your body as your limbs move in space. So if you do have poor pelvic floor integrity, it would lead to poor core activation, which leads to poor movement patterns, and which leads to pain and dysfunction. Okay, so how does stress affect your pelvic floor? So there is the stress response, so fight or flight. Your core activates, and within your core, we talked about your pelvic floor. There are specific levels of your pelvic floor that start to contract. The most importantly that we're going to come back again in relation to digestion is your external anal sphincter, EAS, as well as your urinary sphincter. So these contract, and those are part of your pelvic floor muscles, okay? So this leads to pelvic floor dysfunction over time if it's continuously contracted. So a non-relaxed pelvic floor will equal to an unsuccessful bowel movement. So pelvic floor dysfunctions is when these layers of muscles weaken, become lax or tighten, preventing the muscles from completing the normal functions optimally. So there's a hypertonic and hypotonic, and they can both lead to poor evacuation or poor bowel movements. Okay. Hypertonic is when the muscles are stiff or go into a spasm. They can no longer stretch appropriately with movement. Hypotonic is when the muscles become lengthened and weak, and they're unable to perform the supportive duties required to stabilize the pelvic organs. So this means that your rectum could actually start to collapse inwards, which causes the angle to be compromised, meaning that you have a poor evacuation. So we'll be speaking specifically about hypertonic symptoms. So you can have pelvic pain, constipation, pain with intercourse, and incontinence. And for us today, we'll be talking about constipation. Okay. So when we talk about constipation, we're going to return back to the Bristol stool chart that Melissa talked about earlier before. So you're thinking about fewer than 3 spontaneous bowel movements per week, and it must include 2 or more of the following. So straining, lumpy or hard stools, so which is a type 1 or type 2 that we're talking about, a sensation of incomplete evacuation, a sensation of obstruction or blockage, which is what we talked about when we talked about a hypotonic pelvic floor, or you may have to have manual maneuvers to facilitate defecation. So this is within the last or the beginning quarter of your defecation process. Okay. So with constipation, we are talking about having the key muscles that we're really focused about is the puborectalis and the external anal sphincter. So we're just going to stop the screen again, and then I'm going to share with you guys once more. Okay. And we're going to landmark again. So right over here, this is your tailbone. Over here, this is your pubic bone. Okay. You can see your external anal sphincter, if we turn that around, is right around here. So this controls the anal opening. Okay. So when it's relaxed, your anus opens, you can have a good bowel movement. When it contracts, it keeps it shut. Okay. Within this region, if we come closer, the green part over here is your puborectalis. So this also envelops and surrounds the anal sphincter or the anus. So if it's relaxed, it allows it to open. If it's closed, it stops the rectum, or it stops bowel movements from evacuating fully. Okay. So I hope this makes sense. I know we're going quite quickly. Okay, so just to reiterate again, so when your key pelvic floor muscles are relaxed, they increase the angle between the rectum and the anus, okay? And it helps for a successful bowel movement. Okay. And we'll just go. So what we want to do is actually talk about specific physical therapy interventions in order to help with a good or successful bowel movement. So the treatments that we'll focus on will be pelvic floor awareness and muscle relaxation, breathing techniques, bowel and bladder habits, pelvic and abdominal massage techniques, vaginal dilators, exercises, or scar tissue massage techniques. So for the concept of time, we really are going to be targeting a few of these, which will be number 1, 2, 3, 4, and number 6. So when we're doing an assessment, we really want to make sure that you are aware of what's going on within your pelvic floor. You have good control, so more timing and contraction and relaxation, and you have adequate strength and endurance. Okay. So first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to locate our pelvic floor muscles. So when you're thinking about this, your muscle should pull in and up. So this is to locate it. Okay. We're not trying to strengthen it. We're just trying to locate. So for your urethra, where you pee out of, you're going to pretend to hold in your pee. Okay. For your vagina, okay, you're going to pretend to hold in a tampon. Okay. And for your anus, you're going to pretend to hold in a fart. Okay. So you want to kind of think, are you compensating? Are you clenching your jaw? What's going on within it? Okay. Okay. So let's do a quick poll. True or false? Oh, I ruined it. So true or false, Kegels will cure all your pelvic health concerns, okay? That's actually false. Kegels are not always the answers, and pelvic floor dysfunctions are also due to tight muscles. In regards to constipation with hypertonic pelvic floor, doing Kegels will actually make your symptoms significantly worse. So we do not want to guess as to the integrity of your pelvic floor muscles. We want to assess what's going on first off. With what we want to do is with a hypertonic pelvic floor, which is causing constipation, we want to go through diaphragmatic breathing. So I've done a breathing seminar before. It is key and is essential. It will help to dial down the flight response, and it will trigger the vagus nerve, which will usher us into a rest and digest or feed and breathe activities. It is the most effective, efficient way to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. So what I love about the diaphragm is that it has a beautiful, intimate relationship with your pelvic floor. So this means that when your diaphragm contracts upwards, your pelvic floor, when your diaphragm contracts downwards, your pelvic floor relaxes. And when your diaphragm relaxes upwards, your pelvic floor contracts. So taking a nice deep diaphragmatic breath actually relaxes your pelvic floor muscles, which help to decrease the symptoms of a non-relaxed, tight constipation pattern. Okay. The next thing we want to talk about is our bowel and bladder habits. So we can talk about diet, water intake, exercise, gut motility, positioning, sleep hygiene, and we want to be assuring that we're not straining. So we talked earlier before about that anal rectal angle. So making sure that our position is an optimal position in order to evacuate our bowels successfully. So a healthy positioning is having your hips and knees at about hips and thorax at about 35-degree angle. So you can see within this region, when you're squatting, gravity actually helps you significantly, which helps to empty out your bowels. Sitting at a 90-degree angle, you're almost fighting gravity and also the natural curvature of your tailbone and your pelvic floor in order to get the evacuation or the stool moving out fully. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the gut motility. So Melissa really touched really in depth about how food or digestion works within our intestines. So it goes through our small intestine, then it goes through our large intestine, going first up the ascending colon, then through the transverse colon, down towards the descending colon, out towards the sigmoid, and then through the anus. So what we can do is go through an abdominal massage in order to help to move that stool along. Okay. So one of the things that we're going to do first is landmark at the left hip bone, stroke downwards into the sigmoid colon, okay? And you're going to do that a couple of times, nice and gentle, in order to push out the stool that's there first. Then you're going to go to the left hip, left ribs, and then you're going to go down towards the descending colon. Then we're going to go towards the transverse, and we're going to move across, and then down, and then out. Okay. Again, across, then down, and then out. Okay, and then the last thing that we're going to do for the large intestine is we're going to go all the way up, ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, out. Okay, and again, up, across, down, and out. So that actually makes an I love you. The last thing that we're going to do is we're going to make clockwise directions within the small intestine in order to get that moving a little bit more. Okay, perfect. So with exercise, what it does is that it helps to move food through the colon more quickly and efficiently. It also accelerates your heart and breathing rate, and it stimulates the natural contraction of your intestinal muscles. Okay. One really low impact exercise that you can do is brisk walking. You do not need to do burpees, but you do need to get a nice rotation going in order to kind of stimulate what's going on within your intestinal muscles. We can also go through some exercises in order to help move your help that gut motility move in a little bit more, and really want to focus on some rotation up and down in order to stimulate what the gut is actually doing in terms of that peristalsis movement in order to get the stool moving a little bit more. Okay. So we can do some butterfly stretches, which will help to stretch out the pelvic floor and your adductors, some stretches for your hips and low back. And also child's pose is also a beautiful, delicious stretch that will get things moving quite a bit. Okay, so you may need to ask yourself if you need to see a pelvic floor specialist. And there are some questions that you can ask for your pelvic floor. We're just going to go through this really quickly. So if you need to urinate 5 to 8 times a day, if you feel like your bladder is not emptied, if you feel like you're experiencing urine loss, pelvic pressure, pelvic pain. Okay. If you have bowel movements that are challenging to pass or are less frequent, if you have pain during intercourse, if you have pain with pelvic examinations. So all of these are all telling us that you have a hypertonic pelvic floor or a pelvic floor dysfunction. Okay. So I'm just going to turn it back to Melissa in order to wrap it up and conclude.
Thank you, Joanne. Gosh, this is just so informative. So we gave you some really general recommendations today and kind of an introduction to how Joanne and I would help to support digestion, specifically in lieu of stress. But it's always important to remember that individualized care is absolutely paramount. We're all different, as Joanne mentioned with Kegels, right? Kegels don't work for every dysfunction. We need to have individualized care so that, A, you can get the assessment you need to determine what your concern really is coming from, and then the appropriate treatment to address those concerns and ultimately optimize or improve your digestive function and the quality of those bowel movements. So to conclude overall, it's important to remember health is a journey. It's all about balance. This is going to look different every day, and that's okay. But just really coming back to the basics. What are you putting into your body? How is your body absorbing those nutrients? And how is your body excreting the things it doesn't need via bowel movements? So remembering, and this can look different every day, but just being in tune with your body and respecting your own individual balance and needs. And then, of course, ensuring that you create a circle of care, a circle of support with various healthcare providers that you have good rapport with, that you trust, and who can help diagnose and treat you individually and give you the care that's best for you. So here's our contact info if you'd like some further information, if you'd like to ask questions about today's session, maybe we missed something that you'd like to learn more about, or we're both available for virtual consultation and I believe in-person consultation as of next week. So please feel free to contact us. You have our admin contact there in the center, and then each of our individual emails below our headshots there on the slide. Today's session will also be recorded and I believe could be available depending on your needs. Alternatively, we can answer individual questions over email. And do stay tuned. We're likely going to be doing a part 2 and possibly a series. So keep us posted if you're interested, and we are happy to provide those details when they become available. Awesome. So I think, Joanne, you're on mute, but let me just see if I can view. I think, Joanne, if you can view the questions.
So if you guys have any questions. Yeah, okay, so let's actually pull that up. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for attending.
Thank you for attending. Really appreciate it. And like Melissa said, I know we had a lot of information and we put it together for sure. And we can definitely break things up specifically. There's so much to talk about, especially hydration, water intake, in terms of meals and meal preps and like what it should also look like. Exercises as well, certain exercises to avoid, certain exercises to look into. Yeah, so all of those are really great information that we can definitely delve into. Okay.
All right.
So I think there's one more question. Let's see. Can you post someone's? Yeah, so we do have a breathing webinar that we do have already, and I'm sure, and it has been recorded, so you guys can contact our admins and they'll be able to get that sent to you in PDF format. Okay.
Yeah, breathing is so important. I can't highlight that enough. I'm sure, Joanne, you agree. So incorporating breath work in some capacity daily, whether it's specifically for pelvic floor or to relax that nervous system, just so valuable for digestion and beyond.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I think that is all our questions. Okay, and thank you guys for attending, and I wish you guys a lovely Friday and an even more phenomenal weekend, and we'll go from there. Okay.
Yeah, stay safe, everyone. Be well, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Okay.
All right. Okay, Joanne, talk soon.
Talk soon.